Thank you very much. That was a very stimulating presentation. We're now going to hear from Dr. Peter Rogers, whom I've already introduced. Afterwards, we'll invite both speakers to join me over in the David Cabot setting over here to have a discussion. During that time, we'll also take questions from the audience, and we'll also take questions from those listening via webcast. So as you're thinking, it's a good time to start thinking about questions, jotting them down. But please, a warm welcome for Peter Rogers.
Thank you very much for that introduction. Thank you also to the Food Forum for inviting me to contribute to this very interesting meeting. I've been given this brief to discuss whether the addiction model, or to actually argue that the addiction model is not appropriate for use with food, and I'm going to stick to that brief. What I should, this slide, well, is to say something about me in the sense that, sorry, is that better? Okay, sorry about that. So my interest in this subject really stems from an interest in understanding human appetite and weight control, but also relevant is work on psychopharmacology, and in particular caffeine. And I would suggest that actually caffeine illustrates very well a distinction between dependence and addiction. So most of the people who consume caffeine, and that's a majority of people on the planet, are dependent on caffeine, in the sense that if they become tolerant to the psychostimulant effects of caffeine, and if caffeine is withdrawn, they function below par. We feel fatigued and tired, etc. But that's not the same as addiction, and arguably the addiction potential of caffeine is very low, in the sense that caffeine, a few people who consume caffeine are not able to give up if they wish to, and there's not extreme loss of control around the use of this substance. The other reason for showing this slide is to disclose my funding. So most of the research I've done relevant to this area has been funded publicly by UK and European funds, but I've also received funds from industry, including Sugar Nutrition UK. So this is a headline, one of the more extreme headlines and descriptions that have appeared in the UK press on this subject. So food addiction has generated a lot of discussion and a lot of interest. I question whether this sort of reporting is particularly helpful in that respect, or helpful in informing people about why they might overeat, or helping to encourage healthier eating or weight loss. And I'll come back to that later. So in my talk, what I want to do is, again, define addiction. I know this has been done several times before, but in a very real sense, the answer to the question is whether the addiction model is appropriate to food depends on what definition that we adopt. So I'll spend a little time, again, looking at that. Then I'll summarize some of the evidence from animal and human studies on food addiction. And in doing so, try to discuss whether this concept is useful in explaining overeating, and indeed useful in helping to reduce overeating. So what is addiction? Well, a good place to start is to look at dictionary definitions of this concept, this word, because the dictionary tells us something about how this word is used in everyday discourse. And indeed, one of the definitions there fits very well with the definitions we've seen earlier. This is something about an excessive behavior where control is lost, a behavior that's very, very difficult to change, very, very difficult to stop smoking, stop heroin use, perhaps difficult to stop eating certain foods. But you'll also see that addiction is defined in a much more mild way, a more lenient definition of addiction, really just to point to something that I might do a lot, that I'm particularly interested in. And Charles O'Brien yesterday talked about snow and skiing. Another example might be, I might comment that I'm a soap opera addict. And what I mean by that is perhaps I feel I watch rather too many soap operas on the TV. It takes up a lot of my time. I'm interested. That's not true, by the way, but it could be. Another one closer to the topic is, for today, is chocolate. I might say I'm a chocoholic or I'm a chocolate addict. I think what I'd be saying there, and I might readily admit that more readily than I would admit perhaps to being a heroin addict, I might be, in saying that I'm a chocolate addict, chocoholic, I'm really communicating to you that I probably eat rather more chocolate than I would like to. I'm interested in chocolate. But actually, it's probably not indicating that I have a very serious problem with that substance. So that's a very lenient, in a sense, weak use of this term, addiction. Here is a definition that I quite like, or a summary of addiction, which I tend to use when I'm thinking about this topic. And here again, we've got this extreme state, and we've got this loss of control. And also here, it's clear that dependence and craving are associated with addiction. But I think it's also important to note that dependence and craving aren't necessary features of addiction. So addiction may occur, and that point was made earlier, without dependence and without craving. Now, for the rest of my talk, I'm going to use as a sort of scaffolding a very eloquent synopsis of the case for food addiction made by Ashley Gerhardt. I haven't asked her permission to do this. I hope she doesn't mind me doing it, though. So in this summary paper, target paper, in fact, actually summarizes, I think, as I say, very nicely, some of the evidence in favor or that's been used to argue the case for food addiction. And one of those points is here that foods share multiple features with addictive drugs. So it's argued that there's an overlap between brain mechanisms and behavioral processes involved in eating and those involved in psychoactive drug use or drug abuse. But I would argue that in itself that's not evidence for addiction. It merely shows that drugs of abuse engage some of the same mechanisms that evolved to control adaptive motivated behavior, which would include eating. And it's often said that addictive drugs hijack these same mechanisms, the implication being that drugs of abuse are particularly potent effects, have particular potent effects on those mechanisms. Foods, it follows, have less potent effects, and therefore I would suggest, using that argument, food in general poses perhaps a relatively low risk of addiction. Now, sorry, another argument here concerns work that Neil Cole has just described very nicely, and I won't talk about that, but I will talk about this set of evidence concerning, from animals, concerning how certain foods, certain food constituents might affect reward processes. And the argument here is that consumption of certain foods, high in sugar and fat, cause reward dysfunction, which in turn sets up a vicious cycle, causing further overeating. And again, here there's a parallel with the effects of addictive drugs. And here is some of the evidence for that. What we have here is rats exposed to a cafeteria diet, which Nicole has described just now. So in this particular case, the rats were given chocolate, pound cake, sugar frosting, a variety of other foods. I can't see them all in my notes here, but a variety of energy-dense foods that we would think of as palatable. This is a very reliable way of getting rats fat. Continuous access to this diet makes rats fat compared with their body weight trajectory on a standard laboratory diet. And what we have here is a measure of brain reward, or the rewarding effects of electrical stimulation of the brain. So these rats have an electrode implanted and have the opportunity to press a lever to deliver an electrical current to the brain through that electrode, which they will freely do, presumably because they find that rewarding. What's demonstrated here is that the rats that are exposed to the cafeteria diet show a higher threshold current for brain stimulation reward, and the argument is that's because they are experiencing less reward from that stimulation. This is the evidence for this dysfunction of brain reward, and this is a summary of Johnson and Kenny's arguments based on these and other data. So this is the vicious cycle argument, that exposure to these foods and overweight causes adaptive changes in the brain, or causes changes in the brain, which actually further lead to overconsumption, and the overconsumption escalates. I would suggest, though, that there's an alternative explanation for these data, and actually Nicole, during her talk, presented some very nice data that I also think fit this model rather well. So here is a demonstration of dietary obesity. Rats are offered a variety of energy-dense foods at this point, or they're just given access to fat, to lard along there with their standard diet. They overeat calories, and their body weight increases. But what you'll notice is that over time, food intake or energy intake in these animals declines, and the rate of weight gain plateaus out. My argument here is that this represents a negative feedback effect of the increased weight, increased body fat on appetite. And leptin is probably is one of the signaling substances involved in this process. So as the rats fatten, they become less interested in eating, and as a result of eating less, their rate of weight increase decreases. This makes adaptive sense. As the body stores more energy, actually eating more food is a lower priority than potentially other activities. So I would argue this is an example of an adaptation, a positive adaptation to limit weight gain. When the rats are returned to their chow diet, they undereat. No longer are they stimulated by the energy-dense, palatable foods, and so they undereat on this diet, and I think that's why they also show this low dopamine response to chow in this patient, because of this inhibition of appetite by the increased body weight. A slight diversion here, but I put this slide in because yesterday we were asked what features of the diet might be addictive, or what features of diets might promote overconsumption. I would suggest that certainly in these studies of dietary obesity in animals, it's primarily energy density that's important, and that energy density is a key aspect of the diets of human beings that promote overconsumption. And why that happens is because energy-dense foods are calorie for calorie less satiating than more energy-dilute foods. And additionally, as a result of that, and partly as a result of that, they are also more rewarding. They're more valued. Accessibility, availability of foods all add to that as well in creating this toxic or obesogenic environment that we have. But the main point I want to make here is that these data from animals point to an adaptive response. And here are further data from Johnson and Kenny's research plus other data showing this reduction in brain stimulation reward when rats are exposed to a cafeteria diet and also to addictive drugs. When drugs are withdrawn, that elevation or a reduction in brain stimulation reward declines rather rapidly, but not with the cafeteria diet. And arguably that's the case because this elevation here, this reduction in reward, is related to the obesity of the animal, which takes time to reverse. So this demonstrates this adaptive response. So I think we can rewrite these conclusions with actually more positive conclusions. The observations here don't point to dysfunction, but actually to a functioning system whereby increased weight causes changes that oppose further weight gain, rather than this vicious cycle. So I think we can legitimately rewrite or reinterpret the same findings in this way. Now, there's been a case made based on those animal studies and potentially parallel observations in human beings that indeed deficits in brain reward or food reward mechanisms underlie human obesity. And we heard yesterday a summary of some of that evidence that perhaps is actually less clear than is often stated in the literature. That actually there's the argument goes along the lines that in obesity, eating is less rewarding. Paradoxically, there's lower food reward. And as a result, individuals attempt to overcome that loss of food reward by increasing consumption of palatable foods in order to experience sufficient reward. So that would predict that decreasing brain dopamine ought to increase food consumption. And to cut quite a long story or a very long experiment short, because this sort of experiment takes a lot of time to do, but the best we can do ethically without giving drugs to human beings is to deplete their brain dopamine, to at least to some extent, by depleting them of the amino acid precursors to brain dopamine. So this procedure of acute tryptophan phenylalanine depletion has been used in a variety of studies, for example, in relation to smoking and tobacco use, to investigate the rewarding effects of that behavior in humans. I think we were the first and possibly still the only people to do this in relation to food. So what we might have predicted on the reward dysfunction model is that this procedure, depleting brain dopamine function, should increase eating. If anything, our study showed that it decreased consumption of palatable food in a test meal. These were sweet biscuits that participants had the opportunity to eat to satiety, to eat as much as they wanted. If anything, that reduced this procedure reduced their consumption. So I would argue that's further support for the idea that the changes in brain reward we see in the animal studies are reflecting adaptive changes that counter overeating. Another argument that's often used in relation to food addiction is that people report craving for foods. Food cravings are common, and in the US and the UK in particular, craving for chocolate is often reported. And because of the association between craving and addiction, the argument is that perhaps underlying these cravings is an addictive process. I think we've done quite a lot of thinking about food craving. I think in some ways it's more tricky to study than addiction, in a sense that craving is essentially a private experience. I can tell you if I have a craving. I don't really know of any way that you can get inside my head and find out the truthfulness of what I've reported. In this literature, though, in studies of food craving has been defined as a strong desire to eat a particular food, and we can report on that. We can even, to some extent, measure the strength of that strong craving. It's a strong desire, and it's for a particular substance, a particular food. And we looked at this some time ago, really in terms of thinking about it and drawing evidence together than providing new evidence on the subject. And what we argued essentially is that really craving is part of a normal experience of eating. And what it reflects primarily is the result of attempting to resist eating certain foods. And out of that, we developed what I've called an ambivalence model of craving, and this is applied specifically to chocolate here. So the argument goes something like this, and it's a very straightforward argument, really, is that we get an appetite for a food like chocolate as a result of, well, being reminded about chocolate, being in a place we ate chocolate recently, or being in a mood when I last ate some chocolate, or feeling hungry again, like the time I last ate chocolate. So there are certain situations, places, etc., that we associate eating particular foods. And I would argue that's a normal experience of appetite. So being British, when I come into my kitchen in the morning, I tend to get an appetite for toast and marmalade, because that's what I normally eat in that situation. I don't label that as a craving. I just think toast and marmalade, and I make some toast and spread the butter and marmalade and eat it, and think no more about that. If the toaster was broken, though, I might become a little frustrated, and I might, that thought about not having the toast and marmalade may be a bit more elaborated, and there's a potential that I might even say I have a craving in that situation. Label that frustration and those thoughts about the food that I can't eat as a craving. I think we tend to do that with chocolate and other so-called naughty foods, because we are more likely to resist or try and resist eating those foods. So if I get an appetite for chocolate, but I've also noticed I've gained a few pounds recently, I might say, no, I'm not going to eat that chocolate. And as I've just suggested, denying myself that chocolate doesn't mean the thought and memory of eating chocolate goes away. If anything, those feelings become more elaborated in my mind. And I think that's when I might label my feeling as a craving. And I get that idea in part from the shared models we have about eating, from things we read about and friends and so on. We talk about how our eating is regulated, and ideas about addiction and so on, and articles in the press about chocoholics and so on. So that all increases the likelihood that I'm going to label that as a craving. And as I suggest in this slide, why we resist chocolate is because of our attitude towards this food. It's not a staple food. We may make the attribution, furthermore, of addiction, because craving in our minds is linked to addiction. And arguing that saying that I'm addicted to chocolate helps explain that craving to myself and others, and it also has the function potentially of blaming the food rather than my lack of personal control, for example. So our model here contrasts with the traditional model, the idea that cravings cause eating. What we're suggesting is that resisting eating desired food is what causes a craving. And in turn, we may make these attributions of addiction. So that's really what I've just said is summarized here. So it's actually not so much the chemistry of chocolate or the taste of chocolate, although of course that's to some extent important, so that chocolate is a palatable food. It's sweet and it's fatty, it's energy dense, it's a valued food. But why chocolate is craved is not specially related to those characteristics. It's more related to our attitudes as whether this is a healthy food or not, and those attitudes causing us to potentially resist the food. Those sort of ideas are potentially linked to this discussion of addiction by John Davies, who takes perhaps what many would regard a very extreme view of addiction. His argument is that there's to some extent, addiction is a social construction. It's an explanation of behavior. It's even an excuse that we develop for certain sorts of excessive, extreme behavior. And I think it makes a very compelling reading, the arguments. I'm not going to try and summarize them here, other than to say an argument I think that John Davies makes very well is that the idea of addiction may be actually unhelpful in relation to trying to change behavior, to try and change to a more healthy behavior. And that's what I want to talk about now. I think I'm running out of time rapidly, so this is rather misjudged. But quickly, I have a bit more time. Oh, that's very kind. So thank you. So here and Nicole nicely covered some of these papers as well. So there's an argument here that the attribution or the label of food addiction, is this helpful to us or not? Well, one way in which it might be helpful, and I would argue it's helpful, is that it reduces, along with Nicole, I think it's making the same argument, that it reduces the stigma of overweight and obesity. So the idea, for example, that obesity is a disease or is a disease of food addiction may help reduce the stigma of overweight and obesity, overeating. It may encourage more support for public funding, for obesity research, for obesity treatments, and there's some evidence that that's a case. indeed the case. The obesity as a disease model has been looked at recently, and there's a nice paper in Psychological Science doing just this, which showed that in obese participants, the notion of obesity as a disease, being exposed to that idea, helped reduce body image dissatisfaction amongst those individuals. So that might be arguably a good thing. But it also reduced their concerns about weight, which was associated with higher calorie food choices. So the authors argue here, well, perhaps this is not actually helpful. So we might reduce stigma, but actually the stigma or fear about or concern, dissatisfaction with appearance in relation to overweight and obesity may be motivating factors in trying to change the more healthy choices. And so these models like food addiction and obesity may be taking away that motivation, because they take away the notion that there's a possibility of control here. So that's the basic notion that I'm trying to argue here. By attributing overeating to addiction, we may be taking away a feeling that I can control this behavior, I can change this behavior, because we all know addictions are very difficult to break. We've done preliminary studies on this with my colleague Charlotte Hardman, who's now at University of Liverpool in the UK. And here, in this particular study, very briefly, participants read a variety of passages, and they thought they were commenting on how the font type and how well written and so on these various passages were. But included in these narratives were descriptions that either food addiction had been demonstrated to exist or actually demonstrated to not exist, and weighing up the evidence for and against. What we found was that when given the opportunity to eat high-fat foods like crisps and biscuits, participants who were primed with the idea that food addiction is true actually ate a little, rather more than participants who hadn't been primed with that idea. What was most startling, actually, was that the group of people primed with the food addiction idea had much more variable intake. So that group, some people ate a great deal of food and some ate very little. And I think that's potentially interesting to follow that up. And I think it makes sense in retrospect. And to some extent, we anticipated this. So imagine the effect of the idea that smoking is addictive might have on different people. If I'm already a smoker, then the idea that smoking is highly addictive and difficult to give up is probably not that helpful to me in thinking about I can change this habit. I can become a non-smoker. However, if I'm contemplating smoking, if I'm a young person and my peers are beginning to smoke and I'm contemplating this, and I hear that smoking is highly addictive and it's very difficult to give up, and people who've been smoking for many years really regret taking up, that may be helpful, that notion that smoking is addictive. So it depends on the context. And perhaps the people in our experiment, some people responded by thinking, oh, well, these foods are addictive, I'll just eat them, and that's fine. I don't have any real control over that. And other people actually took the path of thinking, I am not going to try these foods because they'll lead me to overeat and be out of control around this food. I know I've run out of time, and I don't want to take too much more than my fair share of time, so I'll only discuss this briefly. But I would argue, for a variety of reasons, that And we did in our review back in 2000 that probably the best case for food addiction is in relation to binge eating, where there is excessive intake and loss of control. But again, whether or not this is food addiction depends on how addiction is defined. So there's nothing new there other than a case made in this rather nice paper published in Appetite. The number of people with displaying binge eating who could be argued to be food addictive depends on the definition of addiction. If you take stringent criteria, less than half of binge eaters were addicted on those criteria, food addicted. It's certainly the case. So a question is whether, and again this has been raised earlier, but I'll make perhaps a slightly different case. So does food addiction help explain overeating and obesity? Well, there is an association between binge eating and obesity. So people with binge eating disorder are more likely to be obese than those without binge eating disorder, and that's a big difference. But actually the prevalence of binge eating disorder in the population is much smaller than the prevalence of obesity, overweight and obesity. And in the UK at the moment, I checked this morning, I think the figures are 25% of the UK population were, adults were obese in 2012. And looking at Nicole's data, over half of Americans are obese. Is that correct? Overweight or obese. In any case, obesity, the prevalence of obesity is much higher than the prevalence of binge eating disorder. We can look more directly at these relationships. What's the relationship between food addiction, in this case defined by the Yale Food Addiction Scale, and weight status? Well, one study here suggests that around about a third of obese individuals in a particular sample could be claimed to be met the criteria for food addiction on the Yale Food Addiction Scale. Another study, though, more recent, suggests that that was only about 8%. The point here really being that most obese people are probably not food addicted. And I guess this is what I'm summarizing here. So I think at the moment we don't know to what extent eating binges, and if they're defined as food addiction binges, contribute to overeating and obesity. We would need more data than that, though I suspect that contribution is relatively minor. So this is my summary of this part of the talk, that I'm arguing that self-reports of food craving and food addiction are attributions we use to explain behavior. They're not in themselves example of addictive behavior. And more than that, attributing overeating to food addiction might be, in a number of circumstances, counterproductive to successful eating control. And binge eating, which is most like food addiction, probably doesn't explain most overeating. So my final summary slide is, and this is what you'd expect me to say given the remit that I was, that I would argue on a reasonably stringent model of addiction, food poses a low risk of addiction, and it doesn't explain most overeating and obesity. And the food addiction idea has potential to be counterproductive. And I think in that respect, I probably agree, or I come to a similar conclusions to this nice review paper that I've listed a sentence from. Finally, I thought I'd end on perhaps a slightly lighter note, but one that I think cartoons sometimes are very helpful in giving us insight into human behavior. And this one, I think, actually should be labeled Moorishness, which I understand is not a word that's used much in the US, but is in the UK. So Moorishness, for those of us in the UK, describes a food that it's difficult to stop eating. We started eating it, but we're finding it difficult to stop eating. And I think it's related to some of the things that we've been discussing. So here is a person, a woman enjoying eating some chocolates, I think, and she reaches the point where I'm sure what's going on ahead is, I've eaten too many of these chocolates. They're very nice, but I really should stop. This is naughty behavior. And so she gives the chocolates to her partner. But this is the point that she experiences what I would say is moorishness or craving. And we could think of this in terms of food addiction. She really can't stop herself or stop this feeling that she wants to eat more of this chocolate. So her partner does well to resist her imploring him to give the food back. But then, of course, he finally does have to give this food back. And what she's making here, I think, is an attribution about an explanation about her behavior. In this case, it's not that she's weak-willed or addicted, but that, in fact, it's her partner, in this case, who was the one who gave in. As I say, I think that helps give some insight to the mental processes that we experience in wrestling with resisting certain foods. Whether or not that's addiction, I think that's open for debate. Thank you for bearing with me for going over my time.